Hey, what is going on, everybody? It is Rob, aka The Diligent Dev, and a few months ago I created a video going over Firebase Functions, and in particular how to create a REST API using them. And since then, that video has gotten a decent amount of views, and I've gotten a lot of questions out of it. And one of those questions was how to implement authentication. So in this video, we're going to go through our Firebase Functions REST API, and we're going to be using some authentication middleware so that we can lock down our API endpoints so people can't manipulate data maliciously. So let's jump over to the computer and get right into it. Okay, so here we are over at the computer, and since this video is going to build on top of another video I did creating a REST API with Firebase Functions, we're just going to go ahead and clone that repository. If you haven't watched that video and you're interested in watching it, I will link it on the screen right now, and I will also link the URL to this Bitbucket repo. So here we are over at the Bitbucket repo. I'm just going to go up to this clone button. I'm going to copy this out. I'm going to open up a new terminal. I'm going to cd into my desktop directory. And then I'm just going to go ahead and paste that git clone in there, and it's going to go ahead and clone our project. So now that it's cloned, we might as well open it up. So I'm going to open Visual Studio, click on Open, go to my desktop, and find our Firebase Functions API. Now that we're in here, I'm going to go ahead and edit some files here. We're actually going to delete some out because I'm going to come at it from the standpoint of the viewer, of you guys, and you're going to be initializing Firebase in here, and it won't initialize it if we already have some of these Firebase files in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete this Firebase RC file. So go ahead and delete that. Might as well delete the firebase.json, our Firestore rules, and our Firestore index. I'll go ahead and close these out. I'll just update later. And then we're going to head over to Firebase and go ahead and set up a new project. So we'll click go to console up here. I'm going to click add a project, and we'll say Firebase API Auth. Go ahead and hit continue. I'm not going to enable Google Analytics for this project, and I'll create the project. And once it's done creating our project, I will be right back. And now that our project's been created, we're going to go ahead and enable some things. The first thing is going to be authentication. So we're going to click on authentication. We're going to go to sign-in methods. We're going to click on email and password. And I'm just going to go ahead and enable this top toggle and save it. And we see that email and password is now enabled. Next thing we're going to do is go to Cloud Firestore. And up at the top here, we're just going to click Create Database. We're going to start it in test mode. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you're not going to want to do this in a production application. If you're going to put out a production application, make sure you familiarize yourself with Firestore rules, because this is going to allow anybody to read and write to this database. But we're going to do it for now. We're just going to click Next, and we're going to click Enable. And once it's done provisioning Cloud Firestore, I will be right back. And now that our Firestore has been provisioned, what we need to do is install the Firebase CLI if you don't already have it installed. So what I'm going to do is just open up a new terminal. I'll just clear this out. And we're going to run the following command: npm i-g for global, firebase-tools. Now, if you're on a Mac, you might have to put sudo in front of this and enter in your password since you're installing this globally, but on a Windows machine, you won't have to do that. Now, I already have this installed on my machine, so I'm not going to run this command, but what I am going to run, and what you should run after you've installed the CLI, is Firebase login. And what this will do is it will prompt you to log into your account. It'll launch a new browser window, and you can just go ahead and log into it like you'd log into any Google account. You'll see that I'm already logged in as the Diligent Dev at gmail.com, but you're going to be prompted to log in under your account. And what this is going to do is it's going to sync the CLI up with the Firebase tools so that when we provision stuff using the Firebase CLI, it knows which account to use. And now that we have everything set up and ready to go, what I'm going to do is open up Visual Studio, which we have our Firebase REST API project opened in, and I'm going to open a new terminal. And what this is doing is just ensuring that I'm in the root of the project, and we're going to run the following command: Firebase init. It's going to ask us which Firebase features we want to use in our project. And all we're going to do is come down to functions, hit space to select it, and then hit enter. It's going to ask us if we want to use an existing project or create a new one, and we're just going to use an existing one. And then what we're going to do is select that project that we created earlier. So I'm going to go down here and hit enter. It's going to ask us which language. We'll just say JavaScript. We will say yes to install ESLint or use it. It's going to ask us, if we want to overwrite all of these files that are already in here. And this is part of the reason that we deleted a lot of those Firebase files when we first started, was because the Firebase CLI will not initialize because it'll already think that a project has been initialized in here. So it's going to ask us if we want to overwrite all these files that already exist. And we're going to say no, because we want to keep those files, but we just want to point the CLI to use the existing project that we created, if that makes sense. So I'm going to hit no. We'll also hit no here. We're going to hit no for the git ignore. Do we want to install dependencies? We will say yes. And now Firebase is all set up, so it's going to be using our existing Firebase functions, but it's going to be referencing your account so that you could push these to your account and use them instead of referencing my account. Okay, now that that's all set up and done, let's go ahead and look at our REST API and do a little recap of exactly what we did. So you'll see that we have our Firebase functions import. We also import Express. We import the Firebase admin because we're going to be accessing the Firestore. We create an instance of Express that we set to our app, and then we start defining our Express routes. Now, see, we have a /, and this is to get all users. So we grab the users collection, we loop through all the documents, put them into an array, and then pass them back with a status of 200. Now, if we want to get a single user, we would pass an ID. We would go look for that user in the database and grab them and then pass them back. We have a post, and this is for creating a user. So what we did here is we created a user based on the request body that we passed in. We referenced the collection of users and added that user and passed back a status of 201, which stands for created. We also have a put, and this is for updating users. So we would pass in our updates in the request body. We would go grab that user from the ID we passed in the URL parameter, and then we'd update the user and send back a 200. And then for deletion, we would pass in an ID. Then we would go to the users collection, find the document with that ID, delete it, and return a 200. Now, this is all great and everything works fine, but unfortunately we don't have authentication on here. So anybody can go sniff our endpoints by opening up like Chrome DevTools and looking at the network tab, and they could go in here and potentially manipulate data. So what we want to do is lock it down. And just like any other Firebase product, the Firebase team has made this extremely easy for us to do. So if we go and we look at their documentation for their SDKs, you'll see that we can grab something called an ID token on the client. So on the web, we would call something like Firebase Auth current user get ID token, and it's going to give us the ID token, which is essentially a JSON web token that we can pass to our backend and verify it. So if we go down and look at what we would use on our backend, you'll see they have admin auth verify ID token, and if it resolves correctly, then we'll drop that into the then block, or if it errors out, we can handle that error and say that essentially no one's authenticated. And we can see that they have a bunch of different SDKs that you can use in your backend. We could be using Java, Python, Go, or C#. And on the front end, they have the web, C++, Unity, Android, and iOS. But for the front end, I'm going to make this language agnostic and framework agnostic. So what we're going to use is the Firebase Authentication REST API. So if we go ahead and we look at their documentation, and we scroll down a little bit here, we see that we have this URL that we can call our REST API endpoint, and we pass it an API key that we're going to go grab from our Firebase console, and then we pass it a request body payload of an email and a password, and then it's going to return us this secure token, which is our JSON web token. So what we're going to need to do is go to the console, go back to our project, click on this little gear icon, go to project settings, and we're going to copy this web API key. And then what I'm going to be using to create my user or sign a user up is Postman. And I will leave a link to this in the description, and I'll leave links for all these Firebase URLs in the description as well. And I'll just grab the Firebase console and we will stick it over here. And then I will stick the Postman over here. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new request. And I'm actually going to head back to the REST API, Firebase Auth, REST API. And we'll scroll down to that call. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy it out of here. And we're going to paste it in here. And then for this API key, you'll see it down here in our params. We can go back to the Firebase console. We'll copy that and we will stick it in there. The next thing we're going to have to do is pass our request body. So we're actually going to make this a post request. We will go to body. I will click on raw and then we'll go to JSON. Inside of curly braces, we will say email the diligentdev@gmail.com. We have to also pass it a password. And we'll just say password 123. And then we will pass it return secure token. And I got to wrap this in quotes. And we will set this to true. Now that that's all set up, all I have to do is hit send. And we see we get a response back from the REST API and we get this ID token right here. So if I head over to jwt.io and we validate this web token, I'm just going to go ahead and grab it and paste it in here. We see we get all sorts of information in here. We get the user ID, which is right here. That's also the sub. We also get their email. It tells us if their email is verified. We also get some claims, but I'm not going to go into that for this tutorial as it might get too complex. But you see we had a lot of information here that we can access out of this token. And now that we have this token to pass to the backend, what we can do is we can authenticate our REST API. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to minimize Postman for now. Now, since we're using Express for our REST API, we can tap into something called Middleware. Now, think of Middleware as a function that fires between the request and the response of our API, and we can intercept things in between that request and response before it actually hits our endpoints. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the functions folder. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it auth middleware.js. And this is where our authentication middleware is going to live. Now, fortunately for us, the Firebase team has a GitHub repo and it has a ton of sample functions in it. And one of the sample functions is authorizing HTTPS endpoints. So if we scroll down here a little bit, we see we have this function called validate Firebase ID token. And it's doing a lot of stuff, but all we have to do is, I'm just going to copy everything inside of this function. And we're going to paste it into our auth middleware.js. And before we edit anything in this file, let's just go through it and see exactly what this method is doing. So it's going to go ahead and console log to say that it's requesting an authorization with Firebase ID token. And these logs are kept inside of the Firebase console. If you click on your functions tab and go look at the logs for each individual function, you'll go ahead and see your function logs. So what it's doing is checking to see that there's an authorization header and that it starts with bear, and it's checking some cookies as well. And if we don't have those, then it's going to console log an error and return a 403, which stands for unauthorized, and then exit the function. When it gets down to this point, it sets an ID token. We're checking the authorization header exists again, and then that it starts with bear. And if it does, then we're going to console log that it found it. And all bearer tokens start with the word bearer, so it's going ahead and splitting the token and then taking everything after the word bearer. It also checks to see if it found a session cookie and if the cookie contains the ID token. If none of those are true, then it's going to drop down into this else block and it's going to return a 403 unauthorized. Once it gets down to this block, it's going to try to decode the token, and if it decoded it successfully, it's going to log it and set the user equal to the decoded token and return next, which essentially allows it to continue on to our API endpoint. If it does not decode the token successfully, then it's going to return a 403 unauthorized. Now, the way this file stands, we can't exactly use it. We have to add a few things and modify. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const admin here at the top equals require Firebase admin. And then so we can import this and use it in other files, we're just going to remove const and we're going to say module.exports and set that equal to the validate Firebase token ID and go ahead and save everything. Then we're going to head back to our index.js, and right here we're going to go ahead and import our middleware. So I'm going to say const auth middleware equals require, and then the path to our auth middleware. Now there's a couple different ways we can use the auth middleware. We can either apply it to all routes or just a specific route. If we want to apply it to all routes, we'll just say app.use and then pass it the auth middleware. In the event that you didn't want to lock down every single route that you have, we'll just go ahead and comment this out. We can use it like this. We can put it right after our route. We can say auth middleware. And this will only apply this auth middleware to this exact API endpoint. But for now, let's go ahead and get rid of this. And let's apply it to all routes. I'm going to hit save. And then I'm going to come down here to the terminal and I'm going to run Firebase deploy -- only functions. And once the functions get deployed, I will be right back. Okay, now that our Firebase function has deployed, what I've done is I've opened up the Firebase REST Auth API, and we see we have an endpoint here to sign in with email and password, and we have our Postman application open over here. So what I'm going to do is copy this and paste it into Postman. You'll see that this is a post method, so we will change this to post. We need our API key, which we used earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and go to params and copy that out. We need to pass it an email password and the return secure token. So I'm going to go to body, raw, JSON. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to look at the body that I passed in because it should be the exact same. And I'm going to paste that in there, and then I'm just going to hit send. And you'll see we get a good response back. There's a lot of information in here, but the thing that we're concerned about is this ID token. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to open up another tab, and this is where we're going to make our request to our Firebase function. So the first thing we need is our authorization. It needs to be a bearer token. So I clicked on authorization. We'll go down and select bearer token, and then I'll take that token that I took from our last request and paste it in there. We will come over to our Firebase console for our project, and we will go to not Cloud Firestore, but Functions. And we see we have our function in here. So I'm going to go ahead and make this just a little bit bigger so I can copy the URL for that function out of here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a request to this endpoint. And we see we didn't get anything back because I don't have any users in there any longer. This was a function that returned an array of users. We just have an empty array, but we did get a 200 back. So if we take this auth and say no auth, we see we get unauthorized. If I go back to bearer token, luckily Postman does keep this cached. So if I go ahead and delete just one letter off of this, it should invalidate the token, and that is completely correct. So if I add that E back on and hit send, we see we get our empty array back. So our authentication middleware is working. And if we head over to our function logs, we can see all the different logs that are being called inside of our auth middleware. So we can see that the one time we didn't use it and we logged an error, and then when we edited the token, it also errored out, but you can see that on a lot of the requests, it did find the authorization tokens. Now, I know we use the Firebase REST API to generate our tokens because, like I said earlier, I wanted to make this language and framework agnostic, but They offer a bunch of different SDKs, and we'll go ahead and just briefly look at the JavaScript one. In order to create a user, they have this function once you import the SDK into your project called Firebase Auth, create user with email and password. And then to go ahead and sign in your user, they have a very similar function with sign in user. Now, in order to get the ID tokens, you would just call, once your user is logged in, you'd call firebase.auth current user.get ID token, and it'll return you that ID token. And then we've already talked about how you verify that on the server. And there are tons of different SDKs. I'm just looking at web, but they have iOS, Android, web, C++, Unity, and then of course their admin library. But that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for this tutorial. I hope you got some value out of it. And if you did, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And until next time, happy coding.